Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeff Payne. I am at the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies, or what you could just simply call NESA. We're a U.S. government institution, so you know we're going to abbreviate it. This is the 9th session of NESA's Maritime Summer Series, if you want to give it a specific name. And today's conversation is on littoral security. We're joined currently by two experts. And I will turn the mic over to them in a minute to introduce themselves briefly. But as ever, this conversation is focused on the Indian Ocean region in a wider expanse. So everything from the eastern shoreline of Africa over to the Southeast Asian shorelines, down all the way through to the Southern Ocean and Australia, and all the way up to the coastline of the Arabian Sea. We have our third presenter today has not been able to join us as of yet. Well, hopefully he'll join us soon. We have two prominent experts joining us today. I will turn it over to them quickly to introduce themselves. Ian, if you don't mind, we'll start with you, and then Toral to you. So, Ian, please.
Well, good morning, and thanks, Jeff. My name is Dr. Ian Ralby. I am the CEO of I.R. Consilium. We're a family firm that focuses on maritime and resource security, but I previously spent 4 years at NESA's sister center, the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, also abbreviated to ACSS, as well as 3 years working as a maritime crime expert for UNODC's Global Maritime Crime Programme. So I'm delighted to share this session with Toral, so I'll hand over to her.
Thanks very much, Ian. Thanks, Jeff. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Lovely to be part of this discussion. My name is Toral Vadgama. I work for UNODC's Global Maritime Crime Programme as the Indian Ocean Programme Coordinator. Lovely to be here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both. We're going to kick it off with a question that I gave both of you ahead of time. But from there, we'll have a natural conversation based upon what you tell me. I'll have follow-up questions. I know that we will not be able to cover everything today, and I will try to limit how much I speak so I can go into learning mode and we can maximize your speaking time. So our first question is a direct question, but not an easy one to answer, and it is this. What is currently the major impediment for greater security along the Indian Ocean littorals? And it gets to the heart of maritime security as we conceive of it. I didn't give you more specificity than that because I wanted you to focus in on what you think are the priorities. And if you don't mind, Ian, we'll start with you because you were the first in the room technically, so you'll be the first up on the chopping block. But I will turn the microphone to you.
Well, thanks very much, and I think it's a great question to be asking. I think we need to consistently re-ask it because the context is changing so much. 2020 has been by far the strangest year, probably in all of our lifetimes. And I think that if we had asked this 6 months ago, the answer would have been very different. But today, I think currently the biggest concern or impediment for advancing maritime security in the Indian Ocean littoral is actually the danger of retreat from cooperation. We've seen a tremendous amount of effort over the last decade and then some to create cooperative mechanisms and relationships not only between the states within the region but beyond. And all of that is threatened by the challenges brought on through the pandemic and through some of the geopolitical changes that are underway. And so I think there are three elements of that are particularly concerning. The first is just based on the travel restrictions. Seychelles, for example, has said they're not going to accept any visitors for the rest of 2020. The very fact that you cannot visit and engage with people in person, particularly in a country that holds the Regional Center for Operational Coordination for Eastern Africa's Indian Ocean Coordination on Maritime Security, is a challenge. But that is true not just of Seychelles, but of other states as well. And those restrictions limit how we engage with each other. And that is a concern from a very practical standpoint. But there's also the concern about how that influences the thinking toward other states, how people view each other, whether they've done well during the pandemic, whether they haven't, what responses they've had, what issues they've had. And unfortunately, it has colored how the region views some of the international partners, in particular the United States. The U.S. has not come out looking good from this whole situation. We are continuing to see infection rates and death rates at a remarkably high level. And the general perception is that we have horribly mismanaged the pandemic. That affects our reputation and our credibility as a partner, and it also affects our long-term ability to engage with the region in a meaningful way. And so the alignment of cooperation and the mechanisms for cooperation need to be rethought. But there's also a very specific concern. The regional travel and the partners are only two bits of it. We're also seeing a physical revocation of agreements that have been in place for now quite some time. Just this week, Puntland revoked the 2011 agreement with the Seychelles for prisoner transfer for pirates convicted of piracy in the Seychelles courts. I'm sure Toral can talk about this more, but UNODC's Global Maritime Crime Programme has been a major figure in helping establish a regional response to piracy. Certainly the crime most frequently associated with the maritime space in the Northwest Indian Ocean, at least. And saying that no longer will Puntland take the prisoners who are convicted of piracy is a major challenge for how to produce and effectuate legal finish for that particular maritime crime. But it goes beyond that, and I think that this whole retreat from cooperation opens the door for actually more cooperative criminal and terrorist and militant entities. And so we see actually an inverse occurring where criminal groups are becoming more cooperative and overcoming the pandemic in new ways. I think human trafficking is one of those situations where it doesn't quite follow how we would think about things legally. So we normally say, well, now that there are flights and other things closed, it's more difficult to travel. People are unlikely to be trafficked. Wrong. People who would have traveled legally are now finding themselves in a situation where they are turning to human smugglers who are then ultimately trafficking them. And so we're seeing a spike in the movement of people illegally because legal options aren't available. Similarly, on the drug front, what were air routes have become now maritime routes. And so we are seeing a reshift of how drugs are moving, particularly synthetics in the Indian Ocean. And so new networks are forming sort of revised mechanisms for moving drugs, and that brings out new concerns. So the retreat from cooperation on our side parallels a potential increased cooperation on the side of the threats that we face. So those are some of the key concerns I would say we're currently facing in the Indian Ocean.
Thank you, Ian. A good starting point and brings up some of the contemporary issues. Toral, if you do not mind, I will turn the microphone over to you for your response.
Thanks very much, Jeff. And I'm going to keep my camera off because, you know, it's not very clear, and I think this does help. But I think Ian raises some extremely important points, and to be honest with you, quite aligned to what I have to say. But I would like to kind of approach this question, you know, using like 4 slightly different kind of areas that really I see as major impediments. So the first one being the kind of complex legal and jurisdictional issues when we you know, look at tackling maritime crime. As with a large ocean space with, you know, jurisdictional limitations of the high seas, I mean, there's absolutely very high chances of increased transnational criminality manifesting at sea. None of these crimes, unfortunately, happen in one jurisdiction, which then just kind of makes, as Ian said, achieving a legal finish absolutely impossible, or quite complex at least. We're also working across very different legal systems, very different legal frameworks, and also kind of a combination of domestic and international law. So obviously this, to me, poses a huge challenge when we, you know, try and combat maritime crime. And I think piracy was one maritime crime that was, I would say, fairly easy to tackle in many ways because there wasn't any kind of jurisdictional issues, it being, you know, international law. But more importantly, I think it's quite critical, as Ian said as well. I mean, you know, maritime crime is evolving as well. And I think our interventions absolutely have to be targeted to kind of suit this. And that's pretty much my second point, where, transnational crime, looking at the Indian Ocean, in 2002 onwards, piracy was the big thing, and nobody quite knew anything else apart from piracy. But crime in itself is becoming extremely, or rather increasingly sophisticated, as criminal groups are always a step ahead, I would say, exploiting jurisdiction, but also exploiting enforcement oversight, especially on the high seas. But beyond this individual forms of crimes, I think one of the things that we've seen is a little bit of a nexus between crimes, and I think Ian touched on this as well, like maritime terrorism. There is a huge kind of interconnectivity. Piracy kind of sat as a silo, but now what we're seeing is, it's far more dynamic, and also I think, there's more repositioning of maritime crimes, whether it's thematically or geographically, as and when pressure is exerted in terms of deterrence and disruption. So with this complex dynamic, I think it's so it's critical that, of course, we look at things in a slightly specialist way based on kind of national needs, but it definitely needs to be holistic because of this kind of regional cooperation. And I think this is where Ian's point on regional agreements very much comes into place. As UNODC, we spent a lot of time and resource and energy into kind of getting these agreements signed, especially the ones between Seychelles and Somalia and the other states. But this new development clearly undermines all that work that we've put in there. And of course, we've got this responsibility to our donors, whoever kind of invested in UNODC, to kind of support these transfer agreements in a human rights compliant manner. But unfortunately, that then becomes a bit of a challenge, but something that we have to be involved in terms of picking up the pieces. But moving on, the third point I wanted to make is in terms of capacities of these littoral states in tackling maritime crime. Now, we're working with countries that already have extremely strained economies, and to be honest, priorities at times are not always placed on maritime security. It's a little bit like, it's slightly away from kind of day-to-day life. If you can't see what's going on in the waters, then it doesn't really affect us, as in, there's bigger fish to fry, so to speak. And to tackle this maritime crime, I think it's critical, and this is one of, I believe, the Global Maritime Crime Programme's strength, but to tackle it in a multi-pronged approach. So anything that we do in terms of capacity building, it kind of focuses on building capacity throughout the entire criminal justice chain, because there's absolutely no point in kind of, building capacity of the maritime law enforcement officers who do a fabulous job when it comes to, intercepting, say, a narcotics trafficking, operation, interdicting the drugs. But then if there is no legal finish, as Ian says, then, it's pretty much just literally a disruption. And, in a couple of weeks, and we've seen this in terms of trends, in a couple of weeks, that dhow is right back in the Indian Ocean doing exactly the same and hoping to get to their destinations. So once again, it's kind of looking at it in a holistic way. And here I'm talking about kind of national level interventions to littoral states. And then my last point, I'm not going to take on this, but the last point, which is exactly what Ian started off with. It's great to kind of focus on this kind of national level capacity building, but a critical part of this is there's got to be regional cooperation. And without that, it is virtually impossible. None of this sits within one jurisdiction, as I mentioned earlier. But I think the impediment there again is, what exactly, I think all the littoral states see different maritime crimes as different priorities. So once again, with piracy, I say it was easier to tackle because it was pretty much a regional problem, and we were able to provide a regional solution. But currently, I mean, like, you know, for Kenya, for instance, piracy was a big deal because it affected tourism. And now we've got like narcotics trafficking, which seems to be the new kind of maritime crime that, you know, is kind of taking up our time. But you know, maybe it's not at the same level of a priority as piracy was. So again, it's trying to get this kind of consensus between these states, but also trying to get this kind of very collaborative solution. But you know, critical that it's absolutely important that regional cooperation exists. That's it for me, Jeff. Over to you.
Fascinating things in both of your comments, and as I fear, there's too much for me to be able to cover in this session. I guess my first follow-up to what both of you said is something that came up in a previous conversation, and that was both of you brought up kind of the merging of crime, the greater sophistication of illicit networks, how they use and exploit jurisdictional boundaries, and a whole host of other both trade and kind of legal escape mechanisms. But I mean, if you take a step even further back, if we're talking about narcotics trafficking, if we're talking about human smuggling, or migration, illegal migration transport, you know, all the host of other kind of illicit networked criminal behavior going on in the Indian Ocean region, the scale of it is, if you're not familiar with the numbers, is almost terrifyingly high. If you like just see it for the first time on a piece of paper, the sheer number of drugs being shipped, especially you know, heroin and synthetic drugs like methamphetamine and fentanyl and all of these other things. So the question that came up in a previous conversation was this: is that the sheer number of people involved, the sheer number of criminality, the sophistication of the networks themselves. This is a huge economically oriented criminal enterprise. And it has as far-reaching impact as, say, terrorist activities do. But the entire world has a prioritization on counterterrorism, which is a politically oriented criminal enterprise, versus this economically oriented criminal enterprise. So let me ask you why that is. Why do you think that is, that these things like narcotics trafficking and other illicit networked criminal enterprises is not prioritized as highly as the numbers should warrant them to be? Is it because the world sees it as a purely law enforcement criminal activity? Is it because people have kind of confusion when they transfer from the kind of land-based legal and security mechanisms into a maritime-based one? What is your explanation for that kind of reality? Because I agree with that perception that if you're talking about the sheer number and the sheer number of people involved in these enterprises, that these illicit criminal networks are far larger problem than for a lot of countries than direct risk from terrorist activities. So why is it not put on the same level of importance? And I'll let whoever wants to start that question off, because I know it's not an easy one to answer. Ian? Toral, no, you turn your mic on.
No,
I'll give it to you.
Go for it, Ian. Absolutely,
Okay.
Go for it. We'll stick to this routine.
Much to my chagrin. So that is an incredibly difficult question to answer. I think it speaks to a whole range of challenges that those of us who work on maritime crime face. And the issue of prioritization is almost always a discussion when looking at how to confront the wide spectrum maritime criminal activities that we see. And I think that you're right. There is a priority put on counterterrorism, and ironically, in the maritime space, what is often overlooked is how much not only the drug trafficking and the arms trafficking and some of the other more sinister maritime crimes actually support that terrorist activity, but how much the benign illicit activities like charcoal, like sand, like honey, like fuel, like sugar, all actually also contribute not only to terrorist financing, but other things. And we overlook that, and we overlook it to our detriment. So if we really wanted to address terrorism as a holistic problem, we would have to look at the holistic means by which maritime activity supports terrorist networks. And I think that is something that needs to occur, and occur quickly. If you look at some of the successful terrorist activities in the last few years, a number of them have relied in advance of their either attack or takeover on illicit supply chains. And those supply chains involve, yes, the sinister goods like drugs and arms, but they also involve things that we look at as being benign and not worthy of our attention. Fuel is a big one. Everybody needs fuel. It's a ubiquitous commodity worldwide. It's a fantastic way of making money because you can always sell a bit of fuel, but it also is a way of buying the loyalty of communities. If you can provide an economic discount on the price of fuel, you can essentially buy the loyalty of poor and particularly energy poor areas. And so that's been a major tactic used by terrorist organizations, and we don't notice how much that relies on maritime routes. But those routes not only involve the economic side, and this is really important, they also involve a logistics chain. Once you can move things that are legitimate or seem legitimate or at least seem benign through a logistics chain, you can move illegitimate things like arms, like ammunition, like other goods through in order to engage in some kind of an attack. And that funding stream, but that logistics piece also goes to a broader issue of sustainment. We talk about sustainment and logistics as military concepts, but those same concepts apply to terrorist organizations and militant groups, and they are often very good at developing those sustainment and logistics chains without us noticing, through using maritime crime that just appears otherwise benign. And so we do need, I think, Jeff, to reprioritize how we look at some of these criminal groups if we are even going to keep terrorism as the main focus. So we don't even need to change that. We just need to expand how we understand it. Having said that, there are maritime crimes that aren't attached to terrorist organizations that are equally concerning, and we need to pay attention to how much they erode the rule of law and governance in the maritime space and on land, so as to shift the balance as to who's in control. And the question of maritime governance is becoming a real concern and consideration. And the question is, who should be in charge? Should it be the governments whose territory we're looking at, or should it be the criminals who are operating in that space? And obviously the answer is the former, but based on our actions and our prioritizations, we seem to concede the latter. And that is a really dangerous approach. So I think we need to recognize that benign maritime crimes, as well as the more sinister ones, are often used to fund terrorist and militant organizations, to create logistics supply chains, and to create sustainment networks, as well as to buy the loyalty of communities whose silence is required in order to maintain criminal and illicit governance rather than legitimate and state-centered governance. So I hope that somewhat answers the question.
It does. And while you were chatting, we had the Commodore join us, and then we lost him. So we'll see if we can get him back in. But Toral, to you for your response to that very easy question I asked.
Thanks very much, Jeff. I mean, I think Ian's covered that in a very articulate way. I'd just like to really make 2 points. I think, it's a very complex question, and to be honest, I don't think I've got the answer to this, but I kind of feel that, you know, it's very hard to kind of try and evidence this nexus between, you know, narcotics trafficking and maritime terrorism, and I think this is probably a little bit of a gap that, you know, we can all do much better at. And see, right now it's just kind of considered as a kind of indirect effect of maritime security, but it equally needs, you know, just as much emphasis as anything else. I'd just like to also mention an example on this, you know, where we had a maritime terrorist attack in the Indian Ocean in Mozambique quite recently in March of this year, where individuals claiming to be part of the Islamic State carried out a maritime terrorist attack. And, you know, sources, I mean, it's something that we're following closely, but indirectly we have information that this is very much linked to narcotics trafficking. But once again, I mean, as I said, I don't have a very articulate answer to why narcotics trafficking doesn't get the same kind of buzz as CT does. But I also feel that, you know, with narcotics trafficking, there's a little bit of a threat fatigue in the region where, you know, it's like, well, yes, yeah, we've got drugs coming in and people are drug dependent, you know, hey hum. But yeah, that's pretty much it for me, but a very complex question that I really don't have the answer to.
Well, okay, that's fair enough. We have the Commodore with us now. Commodore Bhaskar, welcome. We're glad you're able to join us. We know that sometimes getting into these systems can be a Herculean task. So I'm going to turn over to you for both your introduction and to answer that first question I sent you by email. Your initial thoughts on the challenges facing the Indian Ocean littorals right now. So, sir, to you, if you don't mind jumping in.
Hi, folks. Apologies for getting on board a bit late, but some technical glitches. Very glad to be here. I heard a bit of the discussion. I'll respond to the questions that Jeff had raised. A quick word about myself. I am Commodore retired Uday Bhaskar. I was in the Indian Navy for about 37 years, and I was in a couple of think tanks. And now, of course, I am looking at some of these issues. I've had some very productive and happy engagements with NESA and with Jeff at the helm. So good to see Jeff back, you know, in circuit. In relation to the Indian Ocean and, you know, the question posed by Jeff about the littorals, I had 2 points that I wanted to place on the table. One is, I think there are two ends of the security dynamic in the Indian Ocean. One is that which operates at the macro level, and this is where I think the major powers have to arrive either at a consensus or the lack thereof in terms of how security and stability is ensured in the global maritime commons of which the Indian Ocean is a part. So my brief point is that after the US Secretary of State, Mr. Mike Pompeo, had made his speech, first, the statement of July 13th, which was a suo motu statement on the 4th anniversary of the Permanent Court of Arbitration Award of The Hague in relation to the South China Sea. If you look at that, he says very explicitly that the United States considers that China's activities in the SCS are unlawful. I found that very significant. This is reiterated in some detail in the July 23rd speech at the Richard Nixon Library. So this points to what I would call as the United States throwing the gauntlet down to China in relation to the maritime domain, unlawful, illegal, and saying that we reject the Chinese interpretation of particularly 9- and SCS. But I believe that plays out in the Indian Ocean in a latent way, pointing to a certain degree of a breakdown in the communication or the protocols between the United States and China in the first instance. Nothing has happened just now. This is not the South China Sea. but it doesn't augur well for what I would like to describe as macro stability at the major power, kind of domain. Now, as we proceed down, there are other developments which I think have an impact on the geopolitical dynamic, again China related. The most recent being China-Iran. You would have noted the agreement. We do not have all the detail, but in addition to what China has done in Djibouti, it does appear, and I want to underline the word appear because all this is a work in progress. China wants to get a foothold in not only Gwadar, which is Pakistan, but in Chabahar in Iran. There is another port, which is a smaller port, but all of this would give China a certain foothold and a leverage in the Persian Gulf. And that has, as I said, possibilities, exigencies at the geopolitical level for degrading security as we know it today. So I want to flag that. There are other issues related to Russia, etc., which I don't want to get into just now, but I want to flag this as a major item. The second box I'd like to tick, and then I'll shut up, Jeff, is about the lower end of the spectrum. What in the old days we used to talk about, non-traditional threats to security and issues like terrorism that had just been mentioned, piracy and so on. Now, while these were, shall we say, fairly familiar, all of them, drug running, drug trafficking, piracy, human traffic, slave trades, all of this. Now we have, of course, the possibility of terrorism taking the maritime route. And till now, we could deal with it because there was a certain consensus amongst the major powers, the major navies, the major coast guards, etc. The 2008, experience is very good, where we had piracy off the east coast of Africa, Somalia. The global community got together. Even though we did not have the equivalent of one collective naval force, there were different groups, different task forces operating. The problem was dealt with. I am not sure that we have the same degree of what I would call as consensus now to deal with these threats, these challenges, if they do emerge. And that, I think, is going to pose a challenge. And as I said, these are, political issues. I have another set of, I would say, boxes, points related to the fisheries, pollution, and the blue economy. But I won't get into that now because I think I've, taken more time than you had given me, Jeff. Let me stop here. Over to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Commodore. I'm glad that you're with us. I'm going to open it up to the audience as well in the room. If there's questions that want to be asked, just raise your hand. So obviously, the question I asked before the Commodore was able to get in, his points address that. There's obviously geopolitical circumstances and how prioritization of the challenges occur. There doesn't seem political will to unify on the issue of maritime terrorism, of IUU, of narco trafficking, a whole host of other issues. And honestly, there seems to be a consensus, this may be inaccurate, to kind of leave that for groups like the UNODC. That's why they exist, so that we can focus on the other things. So let me put, given the affiliation that I have and what NESA has, let's call out the United States here. Let's use let me ask you this question. The U.S. obviously is a major maritime power. It is concerned about the Indian Ocean based upon its own strategic documents. It is heavily positioned in the northwest regions of the Indian Ocean. It is keenly interested in what's going on in the Bay of Bengal all the way eastward throughout the Western Pacific. Those are key priority kind of maritime zones for the United States. How can the U.S., if you were going to communicate to Secretary of State Pompeo or to Secretary of Defense Esper, and you had 5 minutes to say, listen, this is something that's tangible, that the U.S. has a capability of doing, and that would be incredibly well received by the Indian Ocean littoral states, that would address your larger strategic aims, but is something that is tied into this more immediate littoral area, what would that be if you had anything? And I'll leave it to whoever wants to jump in, because I know, again, that is not an easy question to just kind of immediately respond. Ian's going to go first again? Okay.
Sure, why not? I think it's a great question, and I think it is something that we need to really concentrate on right now, particularly as I mentioned before, we've taken a credibility hit through the pandemic. And part of what we need to focus on is reestablishing credibility, and I think to do that, rather than focus on what matters to us in the Indian Ocean, we need to actually help the states of the region solve some of the problems that matter to them. And that is something that I think we're totally capable of doing. It might not be what we would normally prioritize in terms of the specific activities. But between lending a voice to certain issues, facilitating interaction between certain parties, helping the free flow of the commerce of ideas and experiences to combat these increasingly cooperative threats that we're facing, and really trying to, as I said, solve solvable problems that exist within the Indian Ocean Basin would put the U.S. in a position to really be both a credible partner and a partner of choice for some of the states. And I think that is something we need to think about, and we need to engage and have an open and honest dialogue with states of the region in order to do. So take any number of examples, but there are issues that we could help solve. For example, and you know I've talked about this a lot in the past, the issue of the FSO Safar off of Yemen. We're talking about an old and decaying tanker that's been sitting for 5 years, more or less unattended. It has 1.14 million barrels of oil on it, and it has an additional 1 million barrels in the pipeline connected to it, and it is under Houthi control. And until that threat is neutralized, we have a ticking time bomb where any day we could see that vessel come apart and spill the contents such that we have an environmental disaster 4 times the size of Exxon Valdez that not only destroys rare and unique biodiversity within the Red Sea, but creates a humanitarian challenge for the region of an unbelievable proportion. And that is something that is extremely solvable. And if we put some attention to it, put some effort into it, and we are starting to do that, but it needs greater oomph in order to get over the inertia that's been setting in for 5 years as this situation has matured into, as I said, a ticking time bomb. But that's just one example. There are so many around the region that we could turn our attention to and really be helpful, as I said, a credible partner that is solving the region's problems, not solving problems that we care about.
Got it, and well said. I don't disagree about the Safar at all. It's hilarious reading news articles about it, just because every news article is kind of like they discovered that there's this huge tanker just sitting in the middle of the Red Sea degrading, and it's like, yeah, no, you're not the first or the 10th or the 50th person to write that same article.
Exactly.
But anyway, so Commodore or Toral, which of you would like to go next? Okay, Commodore, to you, sir.
I said, Jeff, I'll defer and wait for the lady to speak. We are sailors, we are very chivalrous, so I'll wait.
All right, so Toral, to you.
Thanks very much, Commodore. So to answer this particular question, Jeff, I mean, I'm going to come from a very kind of UNODC perspective. The US is a donor to, a large donor to most of the kind of capacity building initiatives that we carry out in the Indian Ocean. But I think in terms of, how we can have more tangible and better effect in the work we do, it's a little bit of a catch-22. I mean, we know exactly what the requirements of every state, every littoral state in the region are, but, our hands are slightly tied when it comes to kind of bidding or fundraising. So, when we're talking to US state departments, obviously they're coming from an angle of, well, this is what our kind of strategic area of focus is, and our interventions should be kind of very specific to, for instance, focusing on maritime domain awareness, because that's really a priority for the US. And you know, it really is a challenge trying to align donor strategies and what their priorities are to what actually the kind of states need. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I think the only way to kind of tackle this from a kind of operational point of view, obviously the strategic part is equally important, but it is very important that we have a multi-pronged approach looking at the entire criminal justice chain. And I think working on the ground with these littoral states, there are lots of low-hanging fruits that we can easily kind of, achieve. But I think that would be my kind of, you know, if we want to have tangible effect, that there's got to be some form, or at least to some extent, some flexibility in terms of how funds can be then programmed into capacity building initiatives.
Understood, and thank you. Commodore, to you.
Yeah. Hi, Jeff. You know, I'm going to respond to the question that you had posed to us, that if we had 5 minutes with Secretary Esper, what is it that one could convey to him? And I want to build on this point made about, you know, what is the current priority as far as the security for the littorals is concerned. And I just want to add to two very, I would say, you know, valuable points and interventions made by my colleagues here, which is that as I see it, if you look at the map of the littorals and their own socio-economic kind of profiles and the level of state capacity, my reading is that, you know, picking up the ticking time bomb metaphor, the pandemic is a huge, huge challenge for all the countries in the region, you know, along the Indian Ocean littoral, as it is for the whole world. Some are more affected, some have a certain capacity to deal with. We in India are going through a surge, and there is all kinds of anxiety about can we or can we not cope with what is, you know, likely to emerge. Now, I said this in a different context, that is it possible for the major powers, those who have the capacity led by the United States, because you said it's the most significant maritime power in terms of capacity and resources, to get all the hospital ships that we have and bring them, you know, as available to countries that need them the most? Now, we know the United States had used its own hospital ship. If I remember right, you brought it to New York to deal with a certain exigency. And again, I'm just reminding this whole group that when we talk about the Quad, which is the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, this came into being because of the December 2004 tsunami. No one referred to it as the Quad at that time, but it just so happened that because there was a humanitarian disaster of this order, these four countries, you know, came, responded, they were there, and gradually it acquired the shape of a Quad. The immediate priority now, I think, is humanitarian, you know, in this region, and it deals with the medical challenge. So if I had my 5 minutes with the two secretaries in the United States, I'd use it by flagging this and saying that forget the fact that the US has distanced itself from the WHO. Forget all the politics that, you know, now surrounds US-China. Keep the India-China line of actual control. We lost 20 soldiers. Keep it as the phrase that has already been said, and get some kind of consensus to bring some medical hospital resources.
Okay, thank you, sir. I'm going to have a follow-up, but I don't want to dominate the entire conversation. So if anyone in here, whether it be another presenter or any of our audience members have questions, please raise your hand, and I will yield the mic to you. But if there is no one who has anything, then I'll do a follow-up. And I'll jump off what the Commodore has said, because I think, Toral and Ian, you also got into this, is that part of the problem, I think, is also a way that security is conceptualized. That security and law enforcement, there's this artificial, and I'm speaking from an American point of view, demarcation there, that law enforcement is separate than security. And there's a operational understanding that reality is not always relevant, because you have, for instance, combined maritime forces based out of Bahrain doing all sorts of what you would call law enforcement interdiction issues when it comes to drug trafficking, illicit smuggling, arms trafficking, et cetera, in the Arabian Sea. So we know that gray holes and white holes, that can change based upon national priorities and kind of the standards of the mission. But let's get beyond even that, and let's get into the issue of the environmental issues, the economy, because we're talking about a region, the Indian Ocean region, that is conceptualized from Wall Street's point of view, or from Lloyd of London's point of view, as on equal footing the future of the global economy, in the same way the Western Pacific is seen. That you obviously have the great economic promise of India. You have the maturation of some of the Eastern African economies over the next century. You have the continued natural resource wealth of the Middle East and the Gulf states. And all of this will culminate into kind of an Indian or an Indo-Pacific kind of future. But that means that the sea, the Indian Ocean itself, is going to remain the key mechanism for this wealth generation. So, if we're talking about the security in the wider sense, the economic security, the way to get the money into these countries so that their security capacity can surge from a natural way because they'll have the budget available. What are some of the things that we should be looking at? What are some of the organizations or things that you've noticed that should be highlighted that have gone beneath kind of the radar of a lot of people? I think that would be an interesting question, because it does get into kind of a comprehensive notion of security. So I'll turn that over to all of you for consideration and response. Commodore.
I just want to give a two-finger response to this, Jeff.
Sure.
Because one of the items that I couldn't introduce in the first round is that we have a nascent blue dot network, which some countries have signed up to. Now, at the geopolitical level, this is being seen as something which is a kind of contrast or a counterpoise to the Chinese BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, in its most flexible and I would say most empathetic interpretation, the Blue Dot Network could possibly help revive some of the aspects of the blue economy for those countries that could benefit from a certain geographic, natural resource kind of, shall we say, availability. And they are unable to maximize it due to lack of investment, infrastructure, technology. So I'm just extending what I see as the umbrella of the BDN, the Blue Dot Network, and use the resources of those who have it and the technology, and to do a couple of pilot projects so that confidence is instilled in some of these countries, whether they're island states or the littorals on the African coast or in Asia, and make a visible impact on the socio-economic conditions of the people, in effect, the human security. So let me close here and back to you, Jeff.
Thank you, sir. Well taken. And I think the idea of a pilot program for the Blue Dot Network, which is seen primarily as a Pacific enterprise, I think is worthy of pushing further. Ian, you saw your hand went up to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I think the Commodore is absolutely right. And I think that the time is particularly ripe for innovation on this front, because things have changed. Coastal tourism, certain recreational activities, other things are at a perhaps all-time low in the modern context because of the pandemic. And so how we conceptualize maritime economies and the blue economy in particular as the inclusive, environmentally sustainable and environmentally friendly side of the maritime economy needs to change. And I think you've heard me talk about this before, Jeff. A lot of the world suffers from maritime wealth blindness. Piracy has helped catalyze for many states that the maritime space has value. And we do kind of get the concept that since 90% of world trade happens by sea, no shipping, no shopping. But we haven't quite gotten to the point of understanding the full value of the maritime domain. So a lot of states suffer from maritime wealth blindness. And so part of the role of navies and coast guards alike is to help communicate what I think needs to change in terms of how we view maritime security. Maritime security, if it is articulated as protecting the state against maritime threats, is an unending drain on the economy. And a lot of states right now in particular, as they're seeing budgets and economic might recline and decline, we are probably seeing some hard decisions being made as to where to put funds. But the maritime space continues to be vital to life on land, and we need to articulate that so that we aren't seeing maritime security as being about protecting the state against maritime threats, but rather protecting the maritime space of the state for the enrichment of the state and the betterment of life on land. That against versus for dynamic is extremely important in how we view maritime security, but that also goes to maritime defense. And this is where the blurring that you talk about, I think, really comes in, because the days of sort of a gray hole Navy coming to engage in naval combat with another gray hole Navy may still be with us. I don't want to rule that out. But that isn't the primary focal point of maritime defense at this point. We have all kinds of literally gray zone activities and this hybridized aggression that is particularly visible in the Indian Ocean. And I think that we need to recognize how much the state actors that are excelling at hybridized aggression are taking inspiration from the criminal dynamics that we see. And that sort of understanding that Coast Guard functions have relating to the threats they face now needs to be equally well understood by the navies who are confronting other states through that particular dynamic. And so if we look at the elements of hybridity, we always have a major state that has a conventional force choosing not to use it and instead choosing to do something different. We have a degree of implausible deniability, so we know who did it but can't really pin it on them. We know that they have broken the law at some point in this process, and the activity that they're engaging in is scalable. They can dial up or dial down. And you need no better example than the chain of events involving Iranian aggression against vessels during the summer of 2019, where we said almost a month and a day apart, a series of events against vessels in the Gulf of Oman, the Straits of Hormuz, the Red Sea, and even, you could argue, the drone attack on the Aramco facility, which targeted actually a marine fuel production facility, all sent the message that Iran was able to use hybridized tactics to interfere with, or in their way, sanction the international maritime economy on which we all rely. And so we need to reconceive of how we approach the blue economy, given the changes, and we need to reconceive of how we approach maritime defense, given this blurring line between criminality and state action.
Thanks, Ian. Useful points there, absolutely. Toral, to you, for any comments you have. Yeah, there you are.
Sure. Yeah, I think the key part in all of this is what narrative we're actually kind of putting out. As we all know, law enforcement, maritime security, that's all very hard-edged. But one of the kind of key dynamic changes that we've seen in Kenya is after the Blue Economy Conference, a global conference last year, people have started thinking about the kind of softer element of it. And it's really how you pitch the story. Is it about, as Ian said, it's the Coast Guard providing this kind of very hard-edged security to secure borders, or is it something about losing economy, kind of stopping livelihood in communities to kind of, have a sustainable future. So it's also kind of trying to change that narrative slightly. But as I mentioned earlier, and I think Ian touched on this as well, I mean, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. It's a term we call sea blindness. I mean, people don't really know the magnitude of the crimes. And I'd like to just add one point here. I mean, it's about political will, it's about political priority, but also the kind of white elephant in the room, which is corruption. I wouldn't want to put anything down on record, but I mean, you do kind of hear allegations of big political parties being involved in the kind of narcotics trafficking. So, to me, that kind of, equates to almost kind of a resilience to put something, or rather put a robust framework to completely tackle and combat maritime crime.
Incredibly valuable, addition there. Yes, and the issue of corruption, does matter. I mean, there's no way in an hour-long conversation that we're going to be able to answer these things, but that's kind of what this series is about. I mean, we're trying to have these conversations on an ongoing basis to connect people in a different way. I mean, the case that I always tend to bring up is we do a lot of work at NESA with our colleagues in Sri Lanka, and they have become obsessed. I hear continuously about their concern about narco trafficking off the coast, and the two kind of conversations that kind of always struck me as insane in that particular context is that I witnessed one expert talking to some Sri Lankan security officials say, have you integrated with the local coastal communities on a hotline or some way for them to report directly to naval authorities? And there was just dead silence in response. And because it was an old mentality of there is the state structures and that's what we use. And so there is an issue of that security has to be also sent downward into society. Society has to take on responsibility for some of this themselves. On the upper level, all of the kind of data points that Sri Lanka was looking at were related to what the U.S. did in the Caribbean, which was mainly about the U.S. coming in and providing capacity building, and then what their fellow neighborhood states have done. And I said, well, have you guys looked at the other island states in the Indian Ocean, Seychelles, Mauritius, Comoros, Madagascar, and the issues that they've been facing because they have the same challenges? And they said, no. And so I think that's an issue there. And I'm not to be self-promoting, but me and several other colleagues are trying to cook up a digital way for all of us professionals, subject matter experts, government officials who are working these problem sets can actually have a forum where we're kind of in continuous communication. Engage in that radical information sharing that General Wolf talks about, that I will steal his phrase. So we've reached the time, and the connection held up somewhat. The Commodore's connection has unfortunately betrayed him a little bit. But before we go, if anyone else has any questions to ask or any two-finger interjections they want to make, but if not, Ian, okay, I'll turn it to you real quick.
I just want to thank you for this because I think this is a very valuable discussion. And I think that particularly as we become more and more focused on issues relating to life on land, we run the risk of forgetting how much we're relying on the water. And I just wanted to highlight that at the moment there are 300,000 seafarers stuck at sea, unable to engage in a crew change, that also are paired with 300,000 additional seafarers stuck on land, unable to engage in a crew change, and 600,000 people on whom we rely for our way of life in terms of the global maritime commerce are in a holding pattern, and we need to be aware of that. We need to recognize how vulnerable our global supply chains for everything we use in our day-to-day lives really are. And so I appreciate NESA's role in this discussion because it is all part of turning a spotlight on the issues that are vital to ensuring the ongoing security, stability, and prosperity of life on land. So thank you.
Thanks, Ian. I appreciate that.
Come in for a second. I always say that we need to actually have some tangible takeaways for action. And my immediate action point to you, Jeff, and to commend NESA for your initiative and create this digital platform where I think those who have the bandwidth and the time and the information can chip in and actually try and draw attention of the policymakers in our own countries to look at some of these pressing issues. And I think that having 300,000 people, as has been pointed out, waiting for a crew change is a really critical issue. I mean, anybody who's been at sea would know that. So I just want to say that let's have some action points. And Jeff, you will continue to be the helmsman. How's that? Let me sign off now.
Thank you, Commodore. I don't know if I'm going to let you volunteer me for that, but I appreciate your comments. Sorry about that, General Wolf. Back to you, sir.
Hey, Jeff, not a problem. And thank you to all three of you for participating, and for Jeff for taking this on. It is a labor of love, and you all have highlighted some really key issues. I think what Jeff's tried to do on our behalf is try to to establish several communities of interest that tries to take on some of these issues, but also to serve as a connective tissue, because as Ian knows quite well, we're kind of in government. I mean, we're funded by the U.S. government. So there are ways that we can sit on the periphery, if you will, of the arena, up in the real cheap section, where the tickets are. They're very inexpensive, and it's really hard to see the action down below. But we can kind of tie together some of this community of interest. And the thoughts about trying to keep a platform like this going, and to bring different different parts of that community of interest, or different communities of interest together, whether it's maritime security or the brown water spaces, as you all have talked about so critically, just seems to me is awfully important. And so, just so you know, in the background, Jeff's trying to do this with the Department of Defense into our Department of State, just to raise people's awareness. So that's part of our commitment to you all, as you donate your valuable time to us to continue to highlight these issues. And it's not that you can't do that on your own. My God, we know that you can. But it's trying to just use some other venues to get folks that are in government that don't have a lot of time for this to hear the issues in what I describe as surround sound. You want pleasing music to come out of a lot of different corners of the room, and we want the surround syndrome to kick in. And that's what we're trying to do here, because everyone is consumed with, their day-to-day, the COVID issues, the COVID challenges. How are you doing things virtually? While we seem to have more time to take some of these issues on, we don't seem to be able to highlight those issues that are, in our minds, critically important. So we'll try to continue beating this drum and to use the platforms that we have to, if you will, try to raise people's awareness. Again, I thank you for your.
Thank you, sir. I'm not going to add on to that, because I think that sums up what NESA's kind of mission is. But we are cooking something. It's nascent still, but hopefully in the fall it'll be stood up, where it's not. It'll be multiple forums, but it's essentially a platform for all the various data points to come together, because that's really what we need, is the merging of all the data. There's a lot of great data out there. There's a lot of great projects being pursued. It's just amazing how few people have visibility on all of the things that are going on. And so if we get into the habit of, even if we don't necessarily want to be on the same community, that we do it occasionally, that's a good thing. So the final thing before we sign off is thank you all very, very much for your time, whether it be in the evening, the afternoon, or this morning. We're global in this conversation, and that's a fantastic thing. And I appreciate everyone's viewpoints and expertise. We are happy to be promoters of your own work. So if any of you have written things or have reports coming out for your organization, and you want to use NESA's network as a platform, feel free to send it to me, and we will happily communicate it around and promote it. And do not be surprised. I'm not the helmsman, as the Commodore has volunteered me, but do not be surprised if I become a perpetual hindrance to all of you with more requests in the future. So I thank you all again for time this morning. I wish you all a pleasant day, and stay safe. So thank you all again.